Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this market update. We're thrilled to be participating this year of the CME Agri Month. Thanks for inviting us. And for today, we'll provide you with market update focus in Australia and some key global productions for the grains and oilseed markets. With us today, we have Rodrigo Cortes, the founder of Octopusbot, that will give us the market update for today.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen? Okay. Yeah, okay. So as Carolina said, I'm one of the founders of Octopusbot. Welcome to the meeting today. So the meeting is going to have three items in the agenda. So first of all, we are going to start with a high-level product intro, so you understand, how we create the estimates or where they're coming from, and the method, the special method that we take. And the second one, it's going to be a global market update. We're going to mainly focus on wheat. Maybe we're going to touch on corn a little bit. And then at the very end, we're going to go through Q&A if you have any questions, okay? All right, so starting with how do we create these AI estimates? The first stage is data collection. So basically what we do, we collect data from thousands of different sources, starting from weather. So we can use station data, grid data, soil moisture data, for example, from different weather agencies, right? We combine these, with satellite images. So it could be from Sentinel-2, Landsat we used to use before, or MODIS, way before, right? Then we combine all this data, with yield productions and planted areas. So for this, we go and see the country estimates, for example, such as the USDA, right? Or the main country estimates, depending on the specific country, could be Canadian Statistics or Rustat, for Russia. From there, we also combine it with the global supply and demand. So we obtain the imports, the historical exports. We look at the trade flows, etc. Then finally, we get to the prices, where we can get cash prices for different crops, ports, right? We also get future prices, spreads, and everything else. And finally, we combine everything with global events that are important in the last couple of years, such as the Ukraine war, or what's happening in the Red Sea, or what's happening in the Panama Channel, or for example, Turkey deciding not to import anymore, for the next couple of months, right? So after we collect all this data, what we do, we start with the training of the models. So we create a data set specifically for one model. So let's say we're doing a yield estimate for Rostat, which is one of the southern regions in Russia, right? So we combine the weather data, such as precipitation, for example, frost events, that they were quite important for the month of May, heat events, that they're experiencing today, right, and everything else. So we train these models, with the historical data. So this is an iterative process that we run a couple of hundred times until we obtain a high level accuracy. Okay, so basically, on every training, on every iteration, the model would assign different weights to the different parameters, right, and it would find the relation between the parameters to give us, the best prediction. Okay. Then the accuracy that we check is what we call the cross-validation. So we check the previous years, the previous maybe 10 years, and we calculate this cross-validation up to, our target is normally goes up to 97. If we can get to that level, it means, the model is complete. Okay. So now that we have this model with a high level accuracy, we use this model to run different scenarios for the year because we don't have the actuals of the year 6 months before the harvest, for example. We had to use different scenarios that comes, from the different weather models. So for that, we look at the weather estimates from the different agencies. It could be the ECNWF or NOAA or GFS, right? Or the local agencies such as BOM, for example, for Australia, right? They do have different levels of accuracies or different skills, right? So we try to find the best one, depending on the country, depending on the region, depending on the month release of that particular forecast, okay? So at the end, we use the trained model. We run this weather scenario, and we obtain a prediction for the year for the yields that we can convert to production, and then we can complete the S&Ds and the prices, okay? Okay, so finally, the accuracy depends on the accuracy of the model, which is normally quite high. but it also depends on the accuracy of the conversion of the weather forecast from the respective agency. Okay, so those are the two accuracies that we have. All right. All right. So now with the chain of prediction that we have to get to prices, so we start, from weather agencies forecast for the short term, for the next 10 days, for the midterm, for the next 42 days, or for the next 6 months. So we use those numbers for temperatures, for precipitation, to run through the yield calibrated or trained models with a higher level of accuracy. So then we obtain yield estimates at the local region. For example, for South America, we do that municipality level. For the US, it would be county level. For Europe, NATS1. For Australia, SA2. So depending on the country, we go to the small region level that we have numbers of planted areas, productions, and yields. From there, we obtain the productions. So we use planted areas estimate from different agencies. It could be the USDA. For some specific countries, we do have our own estimates of planted areas. For example, in Australia, we have ground truth data because we've been working with farmers for quite a while. So we can train our own classification models to identify the crops before other estimates. So we obtain the productions. Then we have another set of models to calculate demand or consumption, right? Those models are based on macroeconomics such as CPI, GDP, interest rates. For the scenario of those models, we use the consensus from Bloomberg or from Reuters, for example, for the different KPIs. So then we obtain consumption by country. It could be feed or it could be human consumption. And then from there, based on the previous stocks, so we try to find the most reliable version of the stocks, for every country. We build the S&Ds for the year that it can have very big difference with the USDA. And from there, with that S&D scenario, we run it through price estimate models for the different futures or cash markets to obtain price indications for the year. Okay, we do these for all the grain and oilseeds main growing countries. The accuracy of these estimates goes around 96%. That's the last estimate. That's for the production estimates. 6 months ahead of the harvest, or 6 months against many other agencies, we managed to get inside the 5% of error. Okay. So in summary, we have around 1,500 AI interconnected models, right? And basically, we're simulating the grains and oilseed market, by having these interconnected models. Okay, so whatever happens to corn, for example, in the US, now that they're increasing the production, it may impact, the price of wheat, right? So we see that, from the models as well. Okay. Just to give you one example, so this is the 22-23 season for Australia, so wheat production estimate. For example, standing in the month of April, we ran our estimate with the trained model. In that point in time, we used the year-to-date data, and for the year to go, we were using the bomb forecast at that stage. Then we improved that process, by the way. But at that moment in time, we were obtaining 36 million tons, for that crop, and that's even before the sowing, right? So it's a very early estimate, and it already gave us the indication that we were going to get the highest production ever for Australia, for example. It was a very challenging number at that point in time. So what happened? The estimate moved around, mainly because of the conversion of the seasonal forecast. And we ended up with the accuracy of the model at the end, which is close to the 97%. So, that's when we obtained it, the 39.1. So we didn't depend, on the seasonal focus accuracy anymore, right? You can see the other agencies, for example, that they started at 30 and they reached the final number just in the last release. Okay, so that's kind of like the accuracy that we obtain with this type of models when we run this type of method, or we obtain models, using this method. Okay. Okay, so that's it, on how we create the numbers. So just wanted to make sure that you understand. So now going into the global market update for wheat. For this, I'm gonna get into the platform that we built a little bit, and then we're gonna go into the summary of the different components that we think that are basically the big drivers, for the year. Okay, so what you can see here on the left side is the latest version of the S&Ds of the USDA. On the right side, you can see the latest version of the S&Ds that we produce from our machine learning estimates, running, the weather models, through the estimates. We obtain these productions, then the consumptions, from the other models, and then starting stocks, ending stocks, and export and imports. Those are assumptions that we make, okay, to create these estimates. So starting with Australia, because we're based in Australia, we're gonna deep dive a little bit on that. At the moment, in comparison to the USDA, we're getting 1.4 million tons lower. As you can see, if we go into to the weather tab and we look at the conditions year to date, so for example, this is from April to June, you can see that it's actually quite dry at the moment in South Australia. It's actually one of the driest years of the last 24 years in South Australia. So that's one of the reasons, the yields in South Australia are a little bit lower in comparison to Avers, for example. Something similar is happening in Victoria. Western Australia, they just recovered in the last week that they received 100 millimeters. That weather event that was unfocused that impacted the production estimate by around 1 million tons, by the way, just because they received 100 millimeters, but it didn't happen in every region in Western Australia. Okay, so if we look at, that's the percentage of median rainfalls, but if we look at the soil moisture, basically tells the same story. Okay, this is when they're doing the sowing, in Australia. And then for New South Wales and Queensland, they've been receiving one of the highest precipitation ever, so close to the 2022, and that's why at the moment we're getting much higher forecast than the median, right? And probably one of the best productions ever, for those two states. If we go into the detail of the seasonal weather forecast, so this is the last version from the different agencies, for example, for the different regions that we have wheat, in Australia, you can see that everyone is forecasting. This is the weighted average index using the planted areas. You can see that for the next 3 months, we're getting close to the median rainfalls, but close to the harvest, which is September, October, seems to be that everyone is aligned that we're getting higher than the median precipitation. So that's going to have an effect on protein, of course, right? And on the spreads, for example, between ASW and APW. Okay, so please take that into account. So that's it with the production in Australia for wheat. By the way, our estimates have been trending lower in the last couple of iterations, but with offsets between the states, right? So Western Australia went up, Victoria and South Australia went down, right? And then New South Wales still going a little bit higher, but it depends on the level of water logging, if they can achieve, the highest yield, which was 12 million tons a couple of years ago, okay? Then if we keep looking at the S&Ds and we look at consumption for Australia, for example, we have a big difference with the USDA. Our consumption estimates for the country are saying that we don't have that reduction that the USDA is seeing, that 7 million tons reduction, because of, according to them, the feedlots are consuming less. We don't see that, with our domestic models, for example. So our starting stocks in Australia are 1 million tons or 1.2 million tons lower than the USDA. The same thing with the ending stocks for the market year 2024. Okay. So now getting into Russia. So where things getting interesting, in the last couple of weeks, month. So for that, I'm gonna go into the detailed report. So for Russia, we started with a production of 91 million tons. That was an estimate that we did in the month of November, right? So the winter wheat was already planted, right? The spring wheat is far away from getting planted. As you know, that's in April, the next year. You can see that the estimate went up to 96.4. According to these models, that's the highest number in the history of Russia. These models, they never reached to the 105. They reached 89 in 2022 and 87 last year. So according to these models, this year was very close to be the highest production estimate for Russia. Okay. So what happened? The precipitation forecast didn't convert 3 months in a row. And then we had the frost events in the month of May. And then finally, we're having heat events in the month of June. So at the moment, and at the same time, the planted areas for the spring wheat is going down, right? So this is a little dashboard that we built, with all the regions in Russia. So basically we have models at the region level, right? So we can see that these are the numbers start standing in the month of March. So things were looking pretty good, for the winter wheat regions. What happened is that April, May, and June, these numbers were supposed to be close to the median, according to the ECNWF or according to the US agency as well, but they converted 50% of the median for 3 months in a row. So soil moisture went down from one of the highest or top 3 of the last 24 years. It went down to 18 of the last 24 years or 24 of the last 24 years. At the same time, they had temperature events, so frost events below 0 or temperature events below -2. This is number of days. And now they're having heat events forecasted that some of them are converting. So that's one of the reasons the production estimate is going down. The other reason, this planted area in the spring wheat districts, it's also going down, mainly because it's too wet, as you can see there, in the Siberian district, right? So finally, we're getting 82 million tons. We're not getting the 75 million tons that some of the Russian estimates are giving to us, right? And that's one of the reasons probably why the market, is being buried, in the last couple of weeks. Okay. So continuing on the list, before I finish on Russia, one of the key numbers for Russia is the exports. Exports in Russia, according to the USDA, it's going to be 48, with the 83 million tons that they are forecasting. We're obtaining around 5 million tons lower than that. One number that is key is how much the ending stocks are going to be. In the last 4 years, they've been ending with around 10, 11 million tons, mainly because of geopolitical reasons. Right, according to the majority, they're not going to end below -10. So it might be the case that we are going to have to drop this number a little bit more. Okay. Anyway, moving into the European Union, this number is around 4 million tons lower than the USDA, which is no surprise. If you compare it with the local estimates, it's actually quite similar. Then if we go to the US, that's the other key driver of bearishness in the last couple of weeks, months. Okay, as you can see here, we have a production estimate of 4 million tons higher than the USDA. For this one, I'm going to go into the specific report just to show you a couple of details. We started doing this estimate in the month of Jan. We obtained it much higher than the last year. Last year was around 49. The previous year, I think it was around 45. Correct me if I'm wrong. This year, we've been obtaining 55 for the last 6 months, okay, in a row. According to our models, for the winter wheat and the spring wheat regions, we have a recovery in yields for the winter wheat. So we're getting a yield in between 2020 or 2019. And then we're getting the highest yield estimate ever for the spring wheat regions at this stage of the year. Okay. If you look at the conversion of the seasonal forecast, this is just weighted average, with the winter wheat regions. This is with the spring wheat regions. You can see that the conversion has been actually quite good. And the balance of the year shows higher than median precipitation for those type of crops. And if we do a sensitivity analysis, if you just want to use the medians and don't use the seasonal forecast, we get something between 54.8 or 55.5. So that's kind of like the range of productions that we're obtaining, unless they change the planted areas at the end of the month. We don't see many changes, in this crop, and it's probably much better than the last 2 years. Okay. We also calculate abandonments because that's important for the winter wheat. And we see the lowest abandonment since 2020, by the way, a little bit lower than the USDA. This is 200,000 hectares lower than the USDA, by the way, but it's not a surprise anymore because we're coming from 32.7, which was the highest abandonment in history. Okay. And then we also estimate the varieties, and we're seeing much more hard red winter in comparison to the soft red winter. If you trade spreads, that's basically the spread should be closer to 0. I think we have like 30 cents per bushel spread, but it's not the big difference that we had last year. Okay. All right. So finishing with the US, we had this big gap that it's somehow priced at the moment in the market. So every condition report that the USDA released on a Monday, we can see more and more pricing, this number. On the exports, that's the biggest challenge for this year. If you look at the last 3 years of exports, the US has been exporting 1 million tons less every year. So it went from 2021, for example, at 22, then 21 million tons, then 19.6. But this year, the USDA is forecasting higher exports, but they normally start high and then they reduce lower, right? At the moment, we have 25, which is a very controversial number. And the only reason behind that is because there's no one else, there's no other exporter that can supply the importers at this stage with the levels of stock, that they have. Okay, so that's why we have higher exports for the US. Okay. Okay, moving on to the next country is Canada. Canada, not going to go into the details of the report, but it was quite dry in Saskatchewan and Alberta in the last month. They received really good precipitation in the month of May, over the median precipitation, so that's corrected, the soil moisture, and now they have much better conditions than the last 5 years. So our estimate went up from 34.5 to 35.7. So we're estimating 1.7 million tons higher than the USDA at this stage. Okay. Then Ukraine went down the same with Russia. Then Argentina. Argentina, at the moment, we don't have an estimate. We're just using the numbers from the USDA. We saw the estimate from Bolsa de Rosario that they are targeting the highest planted areas in the history of Argentina. If we multiply those planted areas, if they achieve that target and we use the average yield, we would obtain around 21. So it might be the case that this number is a little bit lower at the moment. Okay. Okay, so that's it for all the exporters. If we look at the stock to use of all the exporters, it's quite critical if you want to find a correlation between the Chicago spot prices versus one of these indicators, probably it's that number, that 30%. You would get maybe like 70-75% correlation. This is basically saying that we have the lowest stock to use since 2007. And similar situation is happening with the world minus China stock to use, by the way. Okay. So now if we look at the major importers, which is all the major importers with the exception of India, so we're separating India, you can see that consumption of these importers is remaining constant. This is where the world consumption normally goes up by 4%, okay, for these particular countries. For the last 4 years, because of COVID and because of macroeconomics, this estimate hasn't been increasing, and that's what we've been obtaining, for the consumption of these estimates. Okay, so basically we have exactly the same consumption, but this is probably going to be affected by the taxes changes in Egypt, or it could be changes by what's happening in Turkey as well. So we think that this number might be a little bit high at this stage. Same situation is happening with the imports of the importers. So it's been stuck at 177 for the last 3 years, right? The USDA is forecasting 177 again, with a little bit of a reduction. The effect of Turkey, if they ban for the next 2 months, if they continue until the end of October, maybe they're going to stop that ban earlier. But if it goes until the month of October, this number should go down by a couple of million tons. Okay. Then lastly, India. For India, we've been obtaining lower than the USDA and much lower than the than the country estimate. So the country estimate is 112. This number is 107.5. It used to be 105. So what happened? They received precipitation during the harvest. It's not the first time that it happens to India. So that's the main factor that why our models reduced the production of the yield estimate for the different regions, right? And because of this, we have an assumption of 4 million tons of imports from India. So the government said no a couple of weeks ago or last week. We're saying that they're going to run out of stock maybe next year. So they need to import at least 4 million tons as they did in 2006 or 2016. Okay. And finally, China, which is in this bucket. At the moment, we are obtaining the highest production in China in history for corn and wheat. Things are a little bit drier, but the seasonal forecast shows very good precipitation in the important month. If they have this production estimate, in theory, they shouldn't need to import as much. So we're reducing the imports to 10 million tons. Okay. In comparison to the USDA, for example, that it's forecasting 11.4. Okay. So finally, if we look at the world ending stocks or world S&Ds, in summary, we have another deficit year, like the last 5 years in a row. So we have 786 in comparison to 787. So that's 11 million tons of lower ending stocks in comparison to the starting stocks. And if we look at the stock to use, it's quite low in comparison to the last few years. If I take China out of the equation, that I can do that here. Sorry, one sec. If I take China out of the equation, basically that number goes to, there you go. So we're seeing numbers closer to 2007, and according to the USDA, is a little bit higher than 2007. Okay, so that's quite bullish, for the wheat markets in particular. Okay. All right. Maybe it's also good to mention that we have to separate the markets in this S&Ds. So not just look at the world. So at the same time, for example, that we have low production, in Europe, we have extremely high production in the US. If they don't export, these 25 million tons, they're going to end up, with an overstock or the highest stock to use, since 2019. And that's one of the reasons we see Chicago market, for example, much bearish. We see Matif kind of like neutral bullish. And then ASX, depending on this production, if it goes to the 26, we're going to see it much bullish, but it depends on the coast in Australia. So we have a bearish market, of course, in New South Wales, Queensland, and bullish market in South Australia, Victoria, and neutral bullish in Western Australia, depending on the conversion of the forecast in the next few months. Okay. All right. So maybe now going into just one price estimate. Okay. So these models were trained with the historical data. They have a high level of cost validation accuracy as well. And we use our scenario of the S&Ds that we run through the models. Okay. So based on our scenario and based on the other indicators that we maintain constant for the balance of the year, just to obtain a number, this model in particular is giving us 640. This is for the December 24 contract, Chicago. Okay. By the way, this is not no advice. This is just numbers that we get from the models. Okay. So we're not giving advice to anyone. So based on the current market at the moment, the December contract is around 620, 630. We're seeing that the market at this stage is trading fair value, which is not what we saw a couple of weeks or months ago, that this estimate was around the same, so the 640 or 650, and the market was trading around 720. Okay. If we look at the numbers for Australia, the 640 would convert to a 350 in Aussie dollars per ton. Okay, if we get a production of 27 million tons, we see a 375 for the harvest period, so between October and March, and this is the numbers that we're obtaining from the model. Okay, by the way, we run these estimates every week, and one big hedging strategy that we run in Australia, which is basis, between Chicago market, for example, we're seeing a basis of $25, which is kind of like the basis average that we obtain in Australia. Okay. All right, so going back to the main presentation, just to summarize the bullish and bearish factors for wheat. Sorry, I forgot one that it's quite key. One sec. Maybe the last factor that is key, for grains, because what happens, to corn, it impacts, wheat, and we can see that, from the models, is the corn US production that we're getting for this year. In the last 2 years, our models obtained lower numbers than the USDA. For example, in 2022, we had a difference of minus 30 million tons with the USDA at the start, and then they pushed down their estimate closer to a number. Okay, so these models, it's quite reliable, that we've been using for a couple of years now, all these models, because we're talking about maybe like 50 models inside this. And at the moment, we're obtaining higher numbers than the USDA. Okay, so we can see that, for example, the conditions and the soil moistures, at the moment, soil moisture is much higher in comparison to the median. They do have high temperatures at this stage that are affecting the crops. If we look at the condition score, it's the top four of the last 24 years. The plant areas were a little bit delayed, by the way, in comparison to last year, so that had a negative effect. But if we calculate the net effect of all the models together, we're getting much higher yields, or the record yields, in the history of the US for corn. Okay. By the way, this is done by region. Okay. So that's the last factor that I missed. Okay, so going back to the bullish and bearish factors, just to summarize, the Russian production, which is probably already fully priced, in the market, the exports that are a little bit lower in comparison to the USDA, but probably the market knows that, the European production, which we have this gap, with the USDA, but not with the local estimates. Then India imports, if that actually happens, that's going to have an impact in the market, because probably the market stopped pricing that in the last couple of weeks. Exporters sending stocks, that's quite bullish, for in general for all the wheat market. But we have to see the specific futures market, of course. Then the world deficit, the 11 million tons. That's probably one of the most bullish factors that we see for this particular market year. Then on the bearish side of things, you have the U.S. production. The U.S. production is probably not totally priced at the moment at 55. Okay, and we can see that the ending stocks might end on a bubble if they don't start exporting, that production that they're going to produce this year, right? So that's quite bearish for the Chicago market in particular. Then Canadian production, we can see better numbers than the USDA, and they may get better if the forecast keeps converting better. Argentina production, of course, it depends, if they're going to achieve that target of planted areas in Argentina. Then the major importers' consumption, that's quite bearish, because we see the trend of the consumption based on macroeconomics getting lower and lower, and that mostly depends on interest rates of the country, for example, of the countries, reducing the rates, and we don't see that. We can see, the interest rates from the different central banks, getting pushed forwards, the decisions, right? So that's having an effect on consumption. And then finally is the U.S. corn production, that at the moment we're getting the highest yields in the history of the U.S. That can change if the acreage at the end of the month get reduced by a significant amount. But even though we see, much better yields in comparison to last year. Okay. So that's it. Do you guys have any questions? Okay. By the way, if you have any questions for any of the estimates or any other countries that I didn't mention, or it could be specific questions for Australia, please let me know. How good are your price estimates? Yeah, so the price estimates depend on many components. Normally, we're pretty good with spreads, which are much easier to forecast at the price or like forward prices. But in the last couple of years, the CBOT price has been quite challenging. Whenever you have fund movements, your estimates are not going to be very accurate. But we're very good, for example, with basis in Australia. We had probably one of the spot-on forecast for basis for, I think it's been 3 years in a row. And the same thing with protein spreads and protein differentials.
I think we had another question from Peter.
Yep. Argentina with outlook. Yes, we're releasing that first estimate in the next couple of weeks, Peter. So at the moment, we're just going with the USDA number, so the 17.5. But according to Bolsa de Rosario, we can go to the 21 if they achieve that target area. What's happening at the moment is that there's many agencies forecasting La Niña. So the US agency, if that La Niña forecast converts, it means very dry conditions for Argentina. So it could be the case that they don't achieve that planted area. So that's one of the reasons we haven't gone, to the Bolsa de Rosario estimate, and we're waiting for our numbers or our estimates before we change that 17.5. Okay.
Next question from Nelson. Do you run estimates on soy and corn as well? And in general, are you bullish, bearish for corn and soy?
For Chicago, for the futures market in soybean and corn, we are quite bearish at the moment. I mean, we were quite bearish all the time, just because of the numbers in the US. Because we're getting that 390 million tons, for example, for corn. It means we're getting like 450 at the moment for corn. Same thing is happening with soybean. Soybean, still many things, can change, of course, right? So we depend on the accuracy of the weather forecast. But at this stage, we're getting 124 million tons, for soybean, which is 3 million tons higher than the USDA. So if that converts, we're getting 1,100 cents per bushel for soybean contract at the one at the start of the next year. So at the moment, we're quite bearish, or maybe we're saying that fair value, the market is currently at fair value.
Next question from John. Do you also incorporate progress in seed improvement?
In some cases, yes. When we have that data, so for the farm level estimates that we're doing for some corporate farmers, yes, we do. We have to, so we look at the specs of the seeds and we try to incorporate them in the training. For the big high level estimates, it's hard to do. So we have a couple of tricks, to try to incorporate technology advances. So we can have a couple of indicative columns, that basically the model gives a weight to those columns. Because, for example, if you run the estimate for year 2000, it would give you, with the same indicators that you have, for example, in year 2023, you would obtain lower yields just because of those columns. So we have a couple of tricks, for the high level estimates to take into account technology, okay, or seed improvements.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining and participating on this webinar. If you have any, we're gonna release the recording of the webinar, and if you have any question, please feel free to reach out. Our details are in our website, and our email is info@octopusbot.com.au. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a good evening.
Thank you.